All right, guys, our goal when we paint is to create the illusion of form with the objects that we're painting. And to do that, we have to be able to add highlights and shadows to our objects that we're painting, or anything that we're painting. So we're starting with spheres because it's the simplest shape. And if you can do a sphere, you can do any other object in any other form, okay? So I've got some spheres here. Some of them already have tints and shades added to them to create those highlights and shadows. But we've got 3 here that do not. They're very flat looking. And the goal is to come back and add those tints and shades to them. Now, the first thing we have to do is we have to practice painting a sphere. So you're gonna come in and you're just gonna like paint a circle. And this is gonna take some practice. You're not gonna get it probably immediately, but with some practice, you're gonna get pretty good circles. Now, I'm not expecting perfection, right? That's not what this class is about. We all have room to improve. And the nice thing about paint is that if you mess up, you can come back in after it dries and fix it by either like painting over it with the background or repainting the actual object itself. Okay, now I've got 1 coat on this, but this is student grade paint, right? We've talked about that before. We can actually see the paper and the brush strokes, and we don't want to see that. So we actually have to do more than 1 coat when we're doing this, when we're painting these. We don't want to see the canvas or the paper. It looks very amateur, and they're like very simple things we can do to help that and make it look more professional. Okay, so if I have 1 coat down, I need to, while this is drying, I need to come in and I need to mix some paint. I need to mix a tint and I need to mix a shade that go with my red, okay? So I'm gonna come in here and you can see my palette here. I've got this you can't see it very well, this very tiny amount of black and a tiny amount of white and some red. I don't need a lot of paint. What we're painting is not a big area, so we don't need a ton of paint. So be very careful when you get your paint out. But what I want to show you is, first of all, we're gonna mix our shade first. And it doesn't matter what you mix when, but I'm gonna get the smallest amount of black, like just the smallest amount, and I'm gonna mix it in with that red to get a darker red. This is my shadow that I'm gonna add to my sphere, right? And if I start out with a very small amount, I can gradually add more and it's not gonna get out of control. I don't want to end up with a palette full of paint that I can't use because it's not the right whatever I need, shade, color, whatever. Okay, so now I've got a decent shadow going right here. Like this is darker than the actual red. And this will work for adding a shadow to my sphere. Okay, now I'm gonna clean off my palette knife and I'm gonna come in and do the same with my white to get that tint. But red overpowers white very fast, right? So we really don't want a lot. So what I'm probably gonna do, see how that, like, I hardly had anything on my palette knife and it's already overpowering my white. Okay, so I've got what turns out to be a pink, because that's what happens when you add white to red, right? It turns into a pink. Okay, so that is gonna be my highlight. All right, so I wanna make sure that I mix those first so that I'm ready to go, because I want to work wet on wet. So the same titles, yeah, whatever, apply to acrylic paint. So wet on wet means that your paint that's already on your canvas or your paper is wet and the brush is also wet too, okay? And you can do both. You can work wet on dry, you can work wet on wet, it doesn't matter. everybody has a preference, but I like to start out with wet on wet. I'll come back in normally later and do wet on dry when I'm just fixing smaller things. But I'm gonna take this sphere right here and I'm gonna put another layer of paint on it. I want it to be wet so that it's easier to blend for my first layer. Okay, so I'm gonna add another layer of red. And I'm not gonna worry too much if I get red outside, because I can always fix that. And then I'm gonna get a different brush and I'm gonna come in and I am going to add my shadow, okay? And I can put this in any way I want, it doesn't really matter, but I wanna be able to blend it out, okay? And I may have to take some of my paint off of my brush to blend it even better. Because sometimes it like, there's just too much paint on your brush. Now, even if, like I'm looking at this and there's quite a bit of shadow on there, I kind of want a little bit more dark right here in the middle. And that's okay, I can do that. And it can be thicker, it does not have to be thin, okay? If I get too much of that shadow out in the center where the mid-tone is, that's okay, because I can come back in later and paint red over the top of that. Okay, now, I've got my shadow, right, in a circular area, right, because we need it kind of like that. Now I'm gonna add my highlight, which is gonna be right here. Okay, now I'm gonna take some of my paint off of my brush and I'm gonna try to blend this a little bit better out here. And if your paint is wet, this blends a little bit better than it would if it wasn't wet. Okay. Now, I want to add a little bit more like white just to the actual highlight right in the middle there. And kind of blend that out. So here's the thing with something like this. It's a lot of fiddling around with things, just fixing things over and over again, okay? So, and that's okay, that's really okay. Now I can come back in with my red and I can like, maybe I wanna like cover up some of that shadow down here because maybe it's a little too intense, and that's okay. And maybe it's a little too intense down here too, and that's fine too. And then maybe I want this to blend a little bit better up here. And I may just have to come back and forth in these areas and kind of mess with things until it blends to exactly how I want it to blend. I want it to be kind of soft. Now, because this is the first layer of highlights and tints, or highlights and shadows, sorry, it's probably not gonna look perfect, and that's okay. I can always come back in later and add more to it, okay? So that is how we're going to add highlights and shadows with our paint. Now, I can come back, once this is dry, I can come back in and redo more of it, and it like just perfects it a little bit more. And that is perfectly acceptable. When I am doing a painting, a lot of times I'm doing at least 3 to 6 layers of paint on anything that I do. So that's normal. That's just what we do when we paint. Okay, so that is how we add tints and shades to our objects, and we create that illusion of form.